The U.S. Air Force and the military has utilized a system called Big Bertha, which actually is 5,000 watts. And that's pretty much the smallest, most portable system that they have. So there's kind of a deficiency in what's available. And what it leads to is that there's either a lack of sterile equipment available, or they have to take a lot more with them. And so it's a logistical constraint as well.
Millions of patients undergo surgical procedures every single day. They place their lives in the hands of healthcare providers who are committed to delivering safe, functional and sterile instrumentation for every surgery. Working behind the scenes are the technicians who go largely unknown, even to the patients whose lives are so dramatically impacted by their work. This is Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing. Join us as we explore this hidden world and introduce you to the unsung heroes who are driving the advancement of our profession. And now your hosts, Justin Poulin, Michael Matthews and Hank Balch.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Daniel Taggart, biomedical engineer and Stereo 3 product manager. Mike, this is going to be a very interesting way to close out Season 3. We're really going to be talking with Dan about extreme sterilization, so remote casualty care and the future of portable sterilization technology. This is, I think, going to be very foreign to a lot of our listeners, but also incredibly interesting and engaging in our interview with Dan today.
Yeah, absolutely. I am incredibly excited for this episode. I'm a bit of a military nerd, even though I've never really served in any way. But one thing I've always kind of wondered about on this side of things is, how is sterilization handled on the front lines in those areas where, you may not have access to full autoclaves or anything like that. And so I am really excited to dig into this and see some of the life-saving innovations that are happening that are being put into use right now.
Well, just before we get started here, I do want to remind everybody that we are getting close to Isham, and we are going to have our annual myth-busting panel discussion once again, so be on the lookout on social media for information in that regard. And also, remember, you can subscribe to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. We can also be heard on the Sterile Education app, available on iTunes and Android. Also, we have a number of resources to give away this season, provided to us by Isham, Amy, CBSPD, Rick Schultz, and Pavel de Sternberg-Stoyalovsky. There will be different ways to win every single week, as announced on our various social media sites, so make sure to follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info, Facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast, LinkedIn.com/company/Beyond Clean, our Instagram page Beyond Clean Podcast. And if you have a question or a future guest for the show that you'd like to recommend, send an email to info@beyondclean.net. Season 3 of Beyond Clean is brought to you by Healthmark and Consortia Surgical. Healthmark has intelligent solutions for your cleaning verification program, including products to measure water temperature, water quality, cleaning efficiency, and directly test for residual soil left on instruments. Find your tools for cleaning verification at hmark.com. There you will learn about their TOSI and SonoCheck that test the performance of cleaning equipment as recommended in sterilization standards guidelines. And Consortia Surgical, the industry's first group service organization with over 100 years of combined experience. They're unmatched experts in the field of flexible and rigid endoscopy, powered surgical handpieces, medical video imaging devices, and surgical instruments and table attachments set them apart as a leader in perioperative equipment management. Consortia was created with a primary focus on safety, customer satisfaction, quality repairs, and end-user training, providing their clients with measurable results, improvement, and cost savings. Contact them today at consortiasurgical.com or 844-394-8900. We'll be right back after a short break. Beyond Clean. Joining us now is Daniel Taggart, biomedical engineer and Stereo-3 product manager. And Daniel, I'm really excited to talk about this because it's not a topic that we've even really gotten close to through almost 70 episodes of Beyond Clean. And I think our listeners are really going to enjoy this one with you today.
Yeah, it should be exciting. I'm excited to share some information that might not be that common knowledge.
Well, I'll tell you, we've titled this one Extreme Sterilization, and really talking about remote casualty care and the future of portable sterile technology. So why don't we talk about just kind of the difference? We know traditional hospital sterilization, large autoclaves, controlled setting, et cetera, et cetera. But you've got a whole entire other world out there that you're existing in where sterilization needs to occur but may not be in these controlled environments. Can you kind of speak to what those situations are, like set the context for the application of what you do with Stereo-3?
Sure. Yeah, and I think you're kind of hitting on the points there in your question, and that's that there's a lot of constraints involved with sterilization outside of the normal realm of a established hospital facility. You know, like you said, where you may have a full-on autoclave system, large amounts of throughput. First and foremost, there's power constraints, and you may not even have stable power grid. You know, even the smallest steam sterilization systems, autoclaves, use about 1,000 watts of power at a minimum. And so, you know, that may be well beyond what the power grid is capable of supporting. And so that's a primary driver for moving to like a battery-powered system, something that could run on a battery. And again, that kind of turns your focus away from steam sterilization, even though it's the standard that has been used for a long time. It's just so hard in terms of power demand to heat water to produce steam. That's where the impetus for looking at different technologies, especially chemical sterilization technologies. The U.S. Air Force and the military has utilized a system called Big Bertha, which actually is 5,000 watts. That's pretty much the smallest, most portable system that they have. There's kind of a deficiency in what's available, and what it leads to is that there's either a lack of sterile equipment available or they have to take a lot more with them, and so it's a logistical constraint as well. There's also potable water constraints. So obviously the steam sterilization systems require significant amount of potable water, not just any water, right? It just can't just be pulled out of a river. You know, that may not be available. And especially in, you know, disaster relief scenarios where the total infrastructure might be compromised. You have also time constraints. So obviously if you're in, for instance, like a battlefield situation or triage or natural disaster relief, you have people who need intervention, surgical intervention. They need sterile surgical equipment quickly. They need it right away, and so they can't wait for things to be shipped to a hospital to be sterilized or you know, the logistics of all of that. And they can't also wait for outgassing or anything like that that might be required for other forms of sterilization. You also have constraints related to chemical transport and toxicity. So if you're looking at other chemical sterilization technologies, you may have trouble just shipping it, right? Or with air transport, it may be regulated that it's not allowed on aircraft travel or air transport. Also environmental constraints. And then a lot of these chemicals have carcinogenic or environmental damaging effects. There's lots of reasons why the standard of care that everyone is accustomed to doesn't necessarily work or apply in a lot of other situations. People may not realize, and that you look at even veterinary or dental and places, you know, in remote locations and low resource locations that may not seem immediately that pressing, but they turn out to be when you investigate it further.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can tell you, you know, even the dental scenarios around the area that I live, they've run into some sterilization issues. And some of it's just about proper process and education for people that maybe aren't doing it in this hospital setting, and so they're not necessarily aware of the details and the requirements for sterile processing. But I wanted to go back a little bit because you mentioned the battlefield. I really want to paint this picture for our listeners about what environments we're talking about. So the battlefield is a great one. You mentioned the U.S. Air Force, and I know you talked about veterinary, et cetera, but are we talking in the midst of combat situations, or is it a little bit back from the battlefield? How quickly do you have to set up these environments to be able to deal with injuries on the battlefield? Can you describe that in a little bit more detail?
Certainly, yeah. So it's actually closer than you would hope to imagine in terms of where they may be. They call it downrange or far forward operational bases, triage scenarios. And they may have, it's a location of opportunity, any location of opportunity. And so you may not have any infrastructure available. And so having a system that is 100% portable, battery powered, and can run with no infrastructure, no interfaces, no potable water, no system capabilities in terms of the facility, you just set it on the counter and it can do the job that is needed. So yeah, it could be even a tent with a dirt floor. It seems odd talking about sterile processing in such a setting because clearly, you're not talking about a sterile field in a hospital in an operating room. But as you guys are probably well aware, having a sterile device, even if the conditions aren't perfect, is still important, right? It's still paramount to the success of the operation and to prohibiting infection.
Yeah, and like you said, the time constraint factor, you don't have the luxury of waiting, and so you've got to make do with what you have. What's that do for, infection rates? Do you notice? I'm sure you track them, but I'm not sure you track them. So is there a difference in the infection rates versus what you would see in the controlled environment?
We haven't done a full study on infection rate because we don't have a clinical trial available. However, from our conversations with the people in the field, the Air Force representatives, surgical techs in the field, they're forced with not even using the sterile equipment at times because they just don't have it. That the difference between not having a sterile, washing it off with water essentially, and giving the patient a lot of antibiotics and having a sterile tool is obviously a huge difference.
So the other thing is the whole steam factor. We just did an interview with Joel Schaefer. I think it's coming out, the one before you, or maybe it was two before you, but either way, we talked about steam. You just mentioned about, potable water and being able to, can't just take it out of a river or take it out of a lake. What do we do about trying to treat that steam, or is that something else that you just make the best, that you can?
I'm sure they would use that water if they had to, in a steam device. But even then, they require a lot of power, 1,000-watt minimum for these pressure cooker type sterilizers that have a minimal capacity and very low reliability and no process feedback, and they have to be hand timed and all of these things. No, I'm sure they would use that if they had to. Obviously, it wouldn't be to the label claim, to the label indications for use. In the situations that they're in, they're trying to save people's lives, obviously, and it's kind of a do-or-die situation. So I think that's a big issue, and they require quite a bit of water as well. It's not a small amount, so it can be really difficult to get a clean water source in a lot of these situations.
In this particular instance, I think a lot of our listeners who are used to being in the hospital setting are sitting here saying, okay, you don't have power, you don't have a reliable water source. How in the world does this product work in this instance?
So you have to turn to a totally different type of sterilization, which is, I think we'll get into more later, but basically it's chemical based instead of thermal. That's another beauty of this system, is that it doesn't require the tools to cool down, which you may not think about, but you can't just take 120 Celsius tool out of this autoclave and then immediately use it. There's that advantage as well. But yeah, certainly it requires you to think a little bit outside the box in terms of what you need to do to provide a sterile tool.
Obviously, Dan, this is a disruptive technology that we're talking about here. And with any new technology coming into a new space, there are barriers. And I'm wondering if you could talk about some of those innovation to market barriers of how this new technology is entering the space, some of the challenges, I guess, in bringing something like this to market.
If you look on the internet, obviously, and do a patent search, so to say, you'll see that there's been ideas around ozone sterilization, hydrogen peroxide sterilization, these other low temperature chemical sterilization technologies for a long time, decades, if not longer, multiple decades. There are numerous technical challenges that are associated with actually transitioning an idea, a patentable idea that's novel, to an actual product that can be used and reliably used. So not only just the technology of the sterilization is technically challenging because it's so much different than what is standard has been used, but then there's also putting that into a form factor that is portable and durable and has the power limitations and the size limitations that are associated with a system like the Ross that is used in remote locations that have limited infrastructure. And the technical challenges primarily are fitting everything into a confined space, right, that is impermeable. Basically, you have these, ingress protection. You don't want any dust or water or dirt or anything to damage the equipment, but yet you have to deal with heat and all the standard things that a lot of products, a lot of technologies have to consider. So it's a lot of balancing of trade-offs, right? Because you want to be durable, and you want to be enclosed in this confined space and have this great ingress protection, but you also need to dissipate heat. You need to, use power as efficiently as possible, and also cost. You have to be able to make something that is affordable at a right price point, even though, as we can talk about more later as well, but the process is a pretty demanding process in terms of oxidation, and so you need expensive materials. You can't just use cheap plastic. So you have to kind of balance all these trade-offs, material compatibility, cost restrictions, to hit an appropriate market value for the device.
And so with this device, I know we've kind of referenced it here and there, but in particular, the device that you work with, how does it actually work? Are there other remote sterilization technologies out there that are doing it differently, but in this same category of you can take it with you to do disaster relief or at the battlefield? Can you kind of talk us through all that?
Yeah, so as I was kind of talking about before, this is a chemical process, and so it's different than the standard sterilization technologies that most people are accustomed to, which use thermal inactivation. And so that actually is another large challenge or barrier to developing technologies because it requires diffusion of the gas. In this case, we use peroxone, which is a mixture of ozone and hydrogen peroxide. And it's considered an advanced oxidation process. It creates extremely potent hydroxyl radicals that react at a very fast rate and basically indiscriminately. And so they're very effective at inactivating a wide range of microorganisms of all types. And there's even some studies that show that it is much better at getting rid of like prions that are fever-causing agents and whatnot that actually can persist throughout, even beyond thermal steam sterilization. So you could essentially have prions in a standard hospital even after a sterilization process. One of the biggest issues you run into, again, is just diffusion. So with thermal processes like steam, the inactivation relies upon temperature. And so once you heat everything to a certain temperature, you can be pretty well assured that it reaches every area, right, within your chamber, even the inside, technically, of the metal surgical instruments. Whereas with chemical sterilization processes, it requires diffusion of that gas into areas, whether it be the confined spaces of jaws of a hinge or lumens, that sort of thing makes it more challenging. That's probably the largest technical hurdle and difference between this technology and others. There are other established chemical sterilization processes. Clearly, there's a large amount of ethylene oxide sterilization. There's also emerging field of hydrogen peroxide sterilizers. But as we talked about with ETO, it requires a very long outgassing period where you have to wait, it's like 12 hours or more for the gas to be outgassed from your sterile environment and from the packaging, so that none of it remains, no residual amount remains, because the compound itself is carcinogenic. And so, that wouldn't work for our setting. There aren't really that many alternatives in the field, unfortunately. that's another one of the challenges, is that there's a lack of predicates in terms of regulatory requirements and in terms of the FDA and getting clearance.
Being that this is a sterilization unit, what did the validation testing look like for this? Was it similar to what we would expect to see in a hospital, or is it totally different than anything else?
It's not totally different. The FDA, they don't give you any breaks, right, because you intend to use it based on where you intend to use it. They still require the same strict validation requirements that any other sterilization system would require. So they want a full suite of process monitoring. They want all the quality control. They want all the same biological testing. So going through and doing the same tests that are recommended for any sterilization system in terms of biological testing, whether it's D-value, which determines the time that it takes to kill. You have to do half-cycle testing, which shows that you can kill at a half cycle, because they require what's called overkill, which means, I think it's technical, but basically you have to kill everything twice. So when you're testing, you always test against the most resistant organism, which is almost always G-stero. And so you test against that, and you have to be able to inactivate it every time at the half cycle. And then they want you to double that. So it's a safety factor. And what it does is provide you what's called a sterility assurance level of 1 in a million, which would mean there would be, out of every 1 million samples, there could only be one possible failure. Because it can never be proven, sterility. Sterility can never be proven. It's always a statistical probability. And so there's all the biological testing that's required. There's also electromagnetic compliance, electrical safety, any emissions, so that you're showing that the sterilant's not being emitted to the environment or the users aren't exposed to it. We've indicated this system for use with stainless steel and tungsten carbide jawed instruments. We did extensive testing with actual surgical tools that the military, in our case, uses, and they're fairly common in the field. And so we do testing with the full load of instruments to demonstrate that the load doesn't impact, or even with impact, it still sterilizes the specific tools. And you implant wires in the diffusion restricted spaces to show that you're sterilizing even the most difficult areas and there's no cold spots or hot spots. Then we did biocompatibility testing of those tools. After we process those specific materials in the system, you have to show that those processed tools elicit no immune response, right? So you do irritation testing, cytotoxicity testing, sensitization testing, acute systemic toxicity, hemocompatibility. So you do the full gambit of biocompatibility tests, just demonstrate that. And again, this goes back to the immediate use necessity of this device, because, if we were talking about ETO, they would fail all of those biocompatibility tests because you would have a carcinogenic reaction. Basically, the chemical is toxic. So that's one of the beauties of this compound, the chemicals that we use, is that they are generated from air and dilute hydrogen peroxide, and they degrade, and the byproducts of the reaction are water vapor and oxygen. And so we actually did a special biocompatibility test protocol where we immediately tested the samples, so to simulate using them right away. And of course, we pass all of those tests really well. And then the shelf life, it's an extensive amount of validation testing and then process monitoring going forward.
So along those same lines, what kind of quality monitoring system are you doing, like on a load by load basis? Are you using BIs that we're used to, or chemical indicators, or what kind of monitoring process are you using on a load by load?
As you probably understand, it may be difficult to use biological indicators on a load-by-load basis when you're talking about immediate use of an instrument, because you're not going to get those results back in time. And so by the time you would know if the BI was negative or not, you had already used the tool. We have talked with the FDA and got support for continual testing with BIs, right? If it's when it's moved, when the device is moved, if it's an installation qualification procedure, essentially. So upon installation of the device, whether that's setting it on the counter, you run a BI, continually monitor the performance of the device. However, we also do utilize chemical indicators on every load. So big development for the future in terms of more rapid BI response and that sort of thing.
So, Dan, this has been a phenomenal interview, and it went really quickly because I just think it's so interesting. But maybe as we kind of wrap, what are the next steps for this types of technology?
We view this as kind of a platform technology. It's like bare bones, simple, one use type. There's not different modes. There's not different cycle types. It's basically you press the button and it does it. It's a 35-minute cycle. And then you utilize the instrument. It holds it under vacuum until you're ready to use it, and then you use it. And it's also primarily developed for the military. We view plenty of uses beyond that in terms of natural disaster relief, again, veterinary, dental, even over-the-counter maybe applications in terms of a low-resource sterilizer that could be in jails or different settings, even tattoo parlors or. One of the other advantages, obviously, as we talked about, is low temperature. So anything that is a low temperature requires low temperature sterilization, such as endoscopes, electronic equipment, temperature-sensitive equipment, which is also a new area of emphasis because there's been so many issues with those type of devices causing infection. So there's a lot of room out there for growth.
What's your ROI like, versus like hydrogen peroxide? Like you just talked about low temp sterilization. Do you have studies on ROI where, it's lower cost for the facility?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of hard to compare our system in ways because it's so different being a portable device as it is. But we use, like I said, we generate ozone from atmospheric air, from the oxygen in the air. And then we utilize a very low dilute concentration of hydrogen peroxide that's not much higher than what you can buy at a grocery store. So in terms of cost, consumables, the cost is very low. And I think, with different modalities or form factors, you could increase the throughput tremendously to where it's, in terms of an ROI for a clinic or something, could be very cost effective and doesn't require a large investment in your infrastructure or in CapEx. And so you could even see, high-level disinfection uses, consumer uses, different things like that, potentially having systems built into emergency service vehicles or for a vet in their truck or a drone that transports it. There's certain interesting fields that you don't really consider, even like the oil fields in the United States. You don't think of the United States as having any areas that may require such a technology, but there's some pretty remote areas that don't necessarily have the resources, or if they do, it's just super expensive for them to ship their equipment to some other hospital, and the time involved and logistics involved with that is quite challenging.
All right, Dan, this was fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on the show. We enjoyed talking with you today, and definitely keep us abreast of how things are going with the business development.
Certainly. Thank you guys so much. It's been a great experience. Appreciate your time.
That was Daniel Taggart, biomedical engineer and Stereo 3 product manager. Hank, talking about extreme sterilization, this is really just some environments that are going to be very foreign to our listeners. Just trying to even imagine doing your job under those conditions is really, I think, it's almost challenging to comprehend in a way, but what an innovative way to be tackling that. And obviously they have their eyes on some other applications that are maybe more stateside and less battlefield.
That's right, Justin. I remember in season 1, we talked to Lucy Nelson in regards to the Mercy ships, and it was mind-blowing to think that there's an entire surgery center on a floating ship out off the coast of Africa, and we're thinking, how do you do sterile processing, much less surgery in that setting? But this takes it a step further to say, no, there's sterilization going on in the midst of battle, in the midst of disaster zones. And again, we take for granted everything that the lights are still going to be on in our hospitals, and that if there's a red line that folks don't cross unless they have on all the proper attire. Totally different world, and yet the science behind sterility is the same. And as Daniel talked about, the regulatory hoops are challenging and yet, helpful too, to make sure that we have a standard of care even in those situations. So great interview. Just as usual, we scratched the surface of a very interesting and complex topic. So I'm sure we're going to continue to find these cool, novel, innovative folks out there to bring some more to the front lines here on Beyond Clean and keep having these fun conversations.
Well, what a great way to wrap season 3. And as we do put this season in the books, I want to thank everybody who engaged us on social media and went and got their CEs. And I know we did a lot of giveaways this season for lots of learning and educational materials and content. So just want to thank everybody for being just so interactive with the Beyond Clean brand. Stay tuned. 5 weeks from now, we will have season 4 kicking off, and that'll be just ahead of the Isham Annual Conference and Expo. And just to let everybody know, we're going to have a table in the expo, and we are going to be doing our Beyond Clean myth-busting panel discussion. Again, you've probably already seen some posts about that on LinkedIn, but certainly more to come as we get closer to the event. And make sure you look for how to register for that event. We sell out very quickly every single year. So that's going to do it not only for this week's show, but for season 3 of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher, and now also on Google Play and Spotify. Simply search for Beyond Clean Podcast. We'd also appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you'd like to share a picture anonymously on our Instagram page, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Mike, and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.